to give a moment for everyone to join us here, and then we will begin. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another IJIA dialogue session. This year, our dialogue series is titled Forms of Protest, Political Art in the Digital and Urban Realm, focused in the Middle East. This annual webinar brings together scholars and practitioners from across various disciplines for a discussion of critical contemporary issues that integrate the boundaries between architecture, art, anthropology, archaeology, geography, and history. In this session, I, Eliana Abu-Hamdi, I'm joined by Middle East scholars Jillian Schwedler, Deen Sharp, Kyle Craig, for this virtual Zoom session to speak about the intersections of art, urban politics, and protest in the Middle East, broadly defined, in the form of public displays of sculpture, art, or graffiti, especially as is related to issues of displacement, dispossession, diaspora, and national identities. The conversation also extends to digital media and hashtag culture, activism, and virtual identities. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers here today, and then we'll move on to our questions that we have. And then, of course, as ever, our Q&A is open. You can enter your questions at any time. So I'll begin by introducing our panelist, Jillian Schwedler. Jillian Schwedler is professor of political science at City University of New York's Hunter College at the Graduate Center and non-resident senior fellow at the Crown Center at Brandeis University. From August 2022 to January 2023, she will be Distinguished CUNY Scholar at the Advanced Research Collaborative at the Graduate Center. She is member of the Editorial Committee for Middle East Law and Governance, and for many years was member of the Board of Directors and the Editorial Committee of the Middle East Research and Information Project, or MERIP, publishers of the Quarterly Middle East Report. She has served as a member of the Board of Directors of the Middle East Studies Association, or MESA, and she is currently on the Governing Council of the American Political Association, or APSA. During the spring of 2020 semester, she was a visiting professor and senior Fulbright scholar at the Center of Global and International Studies at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Schwedler's most recent book, Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent, was published by Stanford University Press in spring of 2022. It's a wonderful read. I highly recommend. Deen Sharp is a PhD from CUNY in New York at the Graduate Center. He's a visiting fellow at LSE in Human Geography and Environment. I just said LSE, I'm going to say London School of Economics and Political Science in the Geography and Environment Department. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, and the co-director of Terraform Center for Advanced Urban Research. He is the co-editor of Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprisings, and Open Gaza, Cairo Press, and Reconstructions as Violence, the Case of Syria, also from American University and Cairo Press, which is forthcoming. I also would highly recommend Beyond the Square. It's an excellent read. Kyle Craig is a doctoral candidate in anthropology and Middle East and North African Studies and a 2022-2023 Alice Kaplan Institute for Humanities Frank Graduate Fellow at Northwestern University. Kyle's dissertation investigates the exponential growth of Amman's political art scene following the 2011 Middle East uprisings, when regional conflict, refugee migrations, and popular discontent prompted individual state and NGO investments in the arts in Jordan. Kyle examines how, through aesthetic expressions and practices, young graffiti and street artists construct and mobilize their imaginations of the ideal future for Amman, and how these imaginations become entangled with neoliberal logics of urban development and the state's regulations of public aesthetics. In addition to his dissertation, Kyle is collaborating with artist Nidal El-Khairi on a graphic novel about the first Palestinian Intifada, and is the editor of an ongoing series of open access essays for Political and Legal Anthropology Review, exploring the aesthetic politics of global right-wing authoritarian and populist movements. Thank you very much. Quite wonderful panel. I myself, I'm an editorial board member of IJIA. I have been with IJIA since, I was trying to remember this morning, I'm going to say 2016, so quite a tenure with the journal. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time hosting a dialogue series. I am currently an associate dean for research at Syracuse University. So I'm here hosting from central New York, where it is frigidly cold and unfamiliar to this California girl, but we're making the best of it. So I want to begin by queuing up the questions here. So just bear with me for a quick second. Questions? Gosh, I should have had these here. I'm so sorry. All right, so if we can begin with our first question, and I'm just going to pose this to the group, and we're just going to have an organic conversation. So the first question to you all will be, how has digital activism helped mobilize protest? Does it help advance movements, or does hashtag culture dilute pursuits or imperatives? So does anyone care to begin?
Well, I could start us off. My recent book, as you mentioned, is focused on protests in Jordan. And while I don't focus on digital activism, I do see a couple of modalities that I think are worth at least pointing out. One is the way in which formally organized protests by political parties, by activist groups of various organizations, almost always have a Facebook events page. So they'll announce them ahead of time and they'll be up there to see. And that's something that's really become quite routine. Of course, it also lets the government know that there's going to be a protest in that particular space. So these are certain kinds of protests that are not intended to be particularly contentious, or to, they're intended to sort of follow a basic routine, to come at a certain time and disperse after a number of hours. So we do see quite a bit of that. You also see a lot of instances where people will go to protests and film themselves at protests or film other parts of it, and those will get posted after the fact. And those have been subject to sometimes government scrutiny over things that people say, things that are critical of the regime. There have been a number of instances of people that are arrested for having posted videos or clips of them at protest online. And so those are some of the ways I'm seeing. I'm not sure that that's really changed the way on the ground protests take place in my own research.
Just to follow up on some of those comments, I think, in my research on Lebanon and the 2019 protests in October, and also I'm based in Sudan at the moment and talking to you from Khartoum, where also in 2019 there was an uprising. And in both these countries, the digital media was absolutely central to organizing protests in much the same way Jillian just mentioned for the case of Jordan, letting people know where to gather. And also, these were across different mediums as well. You've got Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, all of these different tools and Signal that were used different ways, but also, some of the most prominent visuals that came out of the uprisings were, I guess, also circulated through social media. You have the woman kicking a ministerial bodyguard in the case of Lebanon, and the woman on top of a car. And I'll put these links in the chat for people to also just look at independently as well. And so, the fascinating thing, I think, with social media as an urbanist, as I am, is the way in which the two intersect. And it's not a case of social media drawing people away or the urban being divorced from the virtual, but the fascinating way in which the two complement and reinforce each other to a certain extent. There's also, of course, then a whole other side where, again, as Jillian was mentioning, that there's ability to monitor and oppressive counter-revolutionary forces to, counteract and read these organizations. And there's an incredibly complex cat and mouse game that goes on with all these various tools. And again, that really intersect both in the virtual and the urban. So the point also being is that it's really critical to think the physical material and the virtual together and to read them together.
I could press on that just for a moment. I'm curious, because you said there's a way as an urbanist that you don't feel that you can separate the urban from the virtual. And I find that I wonder if in fact our virtual sort of presence doesn't do just that. It kind of creates an insular space where we can exist in a virtual realm where we can be virtual activists without really be experiencing the urban, the urban element of it and having sort of a passive experience. I wonder, does that dilute either our political voice or even our, I'm not really entirely sure what I'm trying to ask beyond that. Is there a disconnect between that virtual and the urban when you are talking about protest, when you are trying to explain this idea of your voice, having a voice in urban protest, but you're doing it passively as a click culture. Do you know what I mean? So just to press on that moment, I'm just wondering if there is a conversation to be had about the virtual and the urban from the position of an urbanist.
No,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's always that element, right? I mean, in the Egypt uprisings of 2011, right, the couch politics became a famous kind of slur, basically. And so there's always, but I think it's really important to emphasize in both the case of Lebanon and Sudan, where there are big diasporas, social media then becomes a critical tool. And there's also, of course, another set of complexities that go with diaspora politics that we could also discuss. But to take the positive elements in this brief comments, I would say that social media does bring a very strong connection to what's happening in these urban spaces of understandings and of ways to draw political support. But yeah, it's definitely not all positive, and diaspora politics is also hugely problematic and complex and messy. All sorts of things to think through and discuss there. But as a broad sweep, there is a huge positive. But and to your point, and I think one argument that came out in the early phase of the uprisings in 2011, right, was that these were Facebook revolutions or Twitter revolutions, right? And we've definitely got to avoid such simplistic narratives and to understand the evident complexities that there are between the physical and the virtual, and what virtual realms can do vis-a-vis what happens materially. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by sharing my screen. One of the images that I chose for this question here was two works by a group called the Encina campaign. Encina meaning have we forgotten? This was a street art campaign that was active in Amman between 2015 and 2016 and focused on spreading awareness of the anti-Palestinian violence connected to Israel's settler colonial project and military occupation in historic Palestine. And it sprayed images related to the Palestinian struggle with usually a focus on children. So you have here this image on the left, you have a young girl wearing a Palestinian kufieh, riding a unicorn. And on the right, you have this kind of like grimly satirical image of a child standing up in a police line. What's interesting about this group is that they hashtagged all of their works like on the public wall itself. And so I came to meet some of these artists by putting this hashtag on my social media pages, and then led me to their Instagram page, which had, explanations of what the artworks mean, and then different like facts and figures about Palestine and different like efforts to like raise awareness about their work. And so what's interesting is that the accompanying the campaign treated the piece of street art not as the sort of endpoint, but rather the starting point of discussion. So offering these like initial arresting images, and then including like a hashtag with it. And so the group explicitly narrows these divides between public aesthetics and the built environment, or public aesthetics in the built environment, and discussions taking place in digital spaces. So this kind of really echoes scholars like Marwan Crady, who talk about graffiti as a form of media, something that's not necessarily separate from media. So a few other things that's kind of interesting about graffiti's relationship to digital spaces is that it can help undercut or contest the hegemony of official state media or other media by offering alternative narratives to events. So this was really prominent during the 2011 Middle East uprisings, where graffiti and street artists were writing and drawing things on walls that contested what was being reported daily in the news. But to your point, Professor Abu-Hamdi, like this kind of there's something about graffiti that's tangible and sort of physical, in that there's evidence that somebody was there and somebody painted or drew something on this wall. Like it's a lot harder to make a bot do a piece of graffiti or street art. But that these two spaces are really connected to each other in interesting ways. Also, digital spaces help undercut the temporariness of graffiti and undercut sort of state censorship of graffiti. And like the Nsina campaign even used their social media pages to talk about the state censoring some of their works. And so like in this regard, kind of digital spaces and physical spaces sort of work in tandem to generate, new insights about the limits of acceptable speech, what makes states or people kind of anxious or uncomfortable, what types of expression make them uncomfortable, and so on and so forth. Another group that's really utilized this is the BDS movement in Jordan against the deal between Jordan and Israel for Jordan to purchase natural gas. Using the slogan, gas of the enemy is occupation, that's on, placards during protests, on hashtags on the internet, but also, spray painted on walls all over Jordan. And so there's a kind of these three working together to create a kind of wider awareness about these issues.
I think, Kyle, thank you for those comments. And these images are also incredibly helpful. Dean, it makes me want to also project your images as well. I think you're actually you're getting exactly the point that I was trying to articulate far better than I had hoped to. This idea of the tangible and the physical, and in contradiction, the representation. And so the representation of these urban interventions are diluted. And what is that then? Does then the political message get diluted along with? And does that then translate differently in the virtual realm apart from the urban realm? And how does affect then correlate to that experience? Because protest in the urban realm is highly experiential. We have a high level degree of affect when it comes to standing opposite, a statement, a political statement of art, of political art, versus experiencing it in the virtual way. So I think I was trying to understand this idea of disruption, this notion of discomfort, of affect when you're actually in the tangible space and experiencing that moment of protest, versus is the virtual just as impactful, just as gripping, just as disruptive, or does it translate in a more passive way? And I don't know that we have the answer to that so much as I'm just trying to press upon that perhaps possibility that virtually we have more of a passive way of looking at things. Sorry. That was what I was trying to say earlier, Dean, trying to articulate anyhow. It's more the idea of representation, rather, this representation of protest versus the moment of disruption of protest. Yeah.
I mean, I think it can span the spectrum. I mean, certainly there are instances where it is the sort of can be just passively consumed, but the way particularly younger generations engage with online media is really dynamic, and it really is a central part of how they think about the world and how they think about what it means to be engaged. The Nsina campaign that Kyle showed, is inviting a dialogue which can be sustained and can have lives beyond just the moment of being in the street. So I think you actually can see quite a range of how it's impactful in certain instances. And, these governments, unlike in the 2010, 2011 period, they now have massive these are non-democratic governments where they have massive units dedicated to monitoring social media and cyber laws that are very repressive. And so, I mean, there is a threat. The government certainly views it as a threat because you don't invest that kind of level of resources if it's something that's not concerning. So I think the cat and mouse metaphor that was used is a really good one, because they're, the government's trying to catch up. And of course, the innovations are happen very quickly and very creatively. I think it's a really fascinating sphere. The intersection of the two is a really fascinating area of inquiry.
I agree. Any closing thoughts on that question? No. Okay. Okay, I would love to move on to the next question I have for us. Is protest a gendered project? Have you seen women more engaged in protest, less engaged? What would you attribute these changes to, whether it's increase or decrease, or potentially no change in your recent research, in your observation?
I have comments, but I don't want to be the first one to start every time. So one of you guys want to just jump in? Deen, go for it.
Sure. I mean, Jillian, I think you're also expertly kind of positioned because yours is such a longitudinal study of 20 years where you were following these protests in Jordan. But so I'll humbly answer, but I think you also have far greater insight in the change. But I will say that in the context of Lebanon and Sudan, again, women were absolutely at the forefront. The images I mentioned earlier, both of them were women. There was a woman kicking this male security guard of a minister who's she's kicking a man that's holding an AK-47 or a military assault rifle, just to show the power and why that image circulated. And in the case of Sudan, there's a woman and these women became known as Kandaka, which excuse me, which relates to the Nubian queens of Meroe, the ancient Egyptian, sorry, bit of a faux pas there, ancient Sudanese civilization and the pyramids that they're famously competing with Egypt for, which is why it's a bit of a faux pas to say Egypt. And these women became known as Kandaka. That was like referencing their fierceness and prominence in the uprisings. So there's another poster, the Sawt al-Mara Thawra, the women's voice is the revolution. And these types of slogans, which were also pushing back very purposefully in there. I won't go into the kind of dialogues, but just very purposely pushing back against conservatism, politics and rhetoric that was trying to suggest that women shouldn't be doing these, and these are kind of or not feminine kind of roles, or where women should be, and there was a very purposeful pushback against that by women, both in the case of Sudan and in Lebanon, with vastly different gender structures and political formats, but nevertheless, very much in both cases, in slightly different forms, women were absolutely at the forefront and really changed what women's agency were in politics in particular was considered, and normative societal roles. I would say both moments in 2019 were very important in making a shift, if not a transformation.
Thank you.
So I don't study protest directly, and most of the graffiti and street artists that I work with actually kind of explicitly distance themselves from politics or political activism, and there's kind of a contrast between Jordan's graffiti and street art scene and some of what's been written about Palestine and the 2011 uprisings and whatnot. And so, like, for example, in Egypt, there's been multiple like feminist street art campaigns that have emerged, like Sit al-Hit, or Women on Walls, and Graffiti Harimi, that seeks to, use public art to draw attention to feminist issues, but also draw attention to gender disparities or gender-based violence that was happening in moments of protest. So in terms of Jordan and in terms of Amman, I mean, one thing that I look at in terms of gender is like artists that get together on Fridays and Saturdays, men and women artists who get together on Fridays and Saturdays and paint during like all day painting sessions. And they're not painting like explicitly subversive or contentious works, but I examine like what are the politics of just like being present in public space. So like briefly, Amman, like many other parts of the world, like has an issue with men harassing women via catcalls, unwanted propositions, staring, so on and so forth. And some prominent efforts to combat that have been met with like public condemnation or resistance. Like one example is the late Professor Rula Kawas, who was, removed from her position of the Dean of Faculty of Foreign Languages at the University of Jordan after she made a video with her feminist theory students about the harassment that they were receiving on campus. And so, some of the women artists that I've spoken to throughout my fieldwork have talked about the experience of being in a public space and doing making graffiti and street art, and how this feels like empowering to them, and it feels like the act itself is a kind of a demand of visibility of a body, of their bodies, and the action that they're doing, as an extension of their body that is outside the kind of masculinist gaze that they receive at certain points throughout their everyday life. This isn't like to not romanticize the politics of graffiti and street art. Of course, it's not like a cure to public expressions of patriarchy, but this is one thing that I found. And in terms of this also is like gender dynamics in terms of male artists, because one thing about Amman is that a lot of the cafes and restaurants, clubs, bars, etc., will exclude young single men from entering the spaces. Sometimes doing this by saying that it's families only day, or explicitly having signs in front of their establishment saying couples only. In one very ironic example, last time I was in Jordan, of one of my interlocutors was commissioned to paint a piece of graffiti in like a high-end shopping mall. And then when he went there a few weeks later, just as a, not as an artist, a security guard stopped him and told him that it was families only day and he couldn't come in. And so these things are also classed, and it's specifically young working class men that are most often excluded from these spaces. And the reason for that is that based on this idea that they're prone to cause trouble or harass women or so on and so forth. And again, not promoting this as kind of like a cure-all to these issues, but there's something interesting about how, women's attempts to address street harassment have been met with different forms of like public resistance, whereas capitalism's response to street harassment is just to exclude all of these men from these spaces. Whereas there's one context, these day-long painting sessions where men and women get together and paint, and are both kind of creating new abilities to be present and express oneself in public spaces. And so it's not a form of protest, so to speak, but it definitely has gendered politics.
Yeah, so to add to that, and I'm going to share an image here. You do find women, active in protests, all, on all topics. I mean, they're quite active. And this is an image I took of a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anti-peace treaty with Israel protest in Western Amman. And this is the tactic you're seeing here is women at the forefront of the riot police. And this is actually something that happens globally as a tactic, where particularly when you have media present, you're almost daring the police to be beating a woman. And so you'll find the women pushing up to the front in those instances. Other really interesting instances I saw that came out of my work is, I didn't really see a change in the participation of women in those, since I've been studying protests closely since the 90s and early 2000s. I saw them, they're pretty much in every protest, but the dynamics are different. So the protest I just showed you, they're really mixed in the crowd. And a lot of the protests, particularly by leftist groups, leftist political parties and the professional associations, the women will be right in there with the men. Mm-hmm. Comparatively, though, when you look at the Muslim Brotherhood protests, they'll have women participate, but they'll have a women's section. So they'll literally have a place where women can assemble, and they'll have parade guards there to make sure men don't get in that crowd so the women aren't harassed. And then they'll move as a section together through the course of a march with parade guards around them. So the women contingent will move together in a particular guarded space. So it's interesting. It's like you can participate, but they're still enacting their patriarchy and protecting women. And one of the interesting examples I saw of this was there's a movement for day wage laborers to have permanent jobs with benefits and healthcare, et cetera. And so the day wage labor movement had been protesting in 2009 and 2010. It was women in the movement that decided they wanted to up their tactics, and they proposed having an overnight sleep-in in the capital. So they went to Amman, more women than men were present, and had this overnight sleep-in. But the same thing happens again here is some groups bring out tents and erect tents so that the women can be sheltered overnight. And the women are given access to use bathrooms in the nearby mosque, but the men aren't. So again, it's like women are fine to participate and protest all they want, but they are still this patriarchy around, like we can protect the women protesters and provide them shelter in a kind of ironic kind of way. So I think those kinds of elements are really fascinating to sort of think through comparatively, and also the way in which, as others have spoken, women are very widely represented in online activism.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the role of women and females, especially in the political venues, are still very relevant. In fact, I would argue that they are valued. There is women often present in areas of voting around election times, and to have women representing a particular party or a particular candidate is very important, and that speaks of that candidate. But like you said, in a comparative way, it's reinforcing that patriarchal structure. But it's not disassembling the norm. It's still women have a very important role to play, but that role is reinforcing a very formed structure, but they are very present in that way. And I found that has not diminished. That role has not diminished, not since I would say the 90s. Like you said, not since the 90s. It's still been a very essential role to play. And it's a very public role as well. It's a very front and public urban role that women will literally stand outside voting areas and election areas as sort of symbols towards the public, the representation of these candidates, of these political interests. I think it's a very interesting sort of space to occupy, not as direct representation, but as symbolic rather. And it's creating a neutral space. And I think that space is a very interesting one to occupy as a woman. And it still happens today. I want to say that we have some questions. There's one specifically about gender in politics and protest, and one a little bit more broad. So I'm going to go ahead and pose both to you, if that's okay, and just we'll go for it. So we have one from Anu. She talks about an interest in the intellectual problem of aesthetics and ecologies of dissent. And she's asking the panel to speak to any longstanding practices, artistic, architectural, et cetera, that engage with dissent through aesthetic or ecological methods and questions. Are there, she asked, any site-specific organizations or practices that we can look at as models for making dissent sensible and palpable over a duration? You want to speak to that?
I mean, I can give just one example in Sudan, actually, that I thought was very interesting, because graffiti is not part of the cultural vernacular here, and those that were doing it in the revolution in 2019 did get a lot of pushback of it, and because those doing it were largely from the Sudanese diaspora, educated in the US and other places in the West in particular. And you know, it was kind of seen as a elite practice. And one young woman who's got a lot of coverage, it was someone called Asil Diab, who, you know, to engage deeper and push the boundaries basically of what was deemed acceptable and part of cultural practice was to go to the houses of martyrs, martyrs' families, and to paint their portraits on the homes of the family. And you know, I would encourage you to look up and see the various interviews and media coverage. That there's some very touching stories and portraits that she created that I think are very powerful and very moving, and I think maybe gets to what Anuradha is asking. And hi, Anuradha, good to hear from you.
Anyone else want to speak to that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have much to say on the aesthetic part of it. Kyle, I don't know, you might?
Yeah, I mean, there's not any organizations right now that I know of that are active in engaging in practices that overtly, you know, dissenting through things like graffiti and street art in terms of, you know, ecology. If I take this kind of bluntly, I mean, there's been, you know, a lot of the graffiti, a lot of the public art in Amman is patronized and facilitated by NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and international government institutions, in addition to state institutions. And a lot of the, you know, topics of like public murals will coincide with the different kinds of like humanitarian trends, or like whatever the theme is of that year for these, you know, the global humanitarian networks. And so for the past couple of years, it's been things related to the environment. But, you know, rather than looking at kind of like the politics of climate change and how it relates to different forms of structural violence and inequality, a lot of what I've seen is a kind of environment sort of talked about in terms of the abstract, like water scarcity, or different kinds of like public awareness campaigns that mostly put the onus on individuals to solve these like larger crises that are, you know, the result of capitalism's, you know, climate destruction. And so like murals that talk about, you know, individual houses needing to conserve water by, you know, spending less time washing their hands, or these like sorts of things that aren't, you know, really practices in dissent so much as they are kind of like shifting from political issues to rather saying that these are kind of social issues or issues of you know, societal kind of habits.
Thanks, Kyle. We have one other question here. The attendee asks, speaking of the role of women in protests, what are your perspectives on the women life freedom movement currently happening in Iran?
Well, I think there's an interesting, I'm not an Iran specialist, but I do know there's long-standing resistance, you know, women's activism that goes way, way back. So it's nothing new. The scale of it's pretty spectacular, and that it's ongoing. But there's, from, I want to say, maybe almost a decade now, but this movement, online site maintained by a female activist outside of Iran called My Stealthy Freedom. And people post under that and would send her photographs of themselves taking the veil off, or standing with the veil on a stick, waving it, or just like the back of them with their hair free, loose. And so these images have been circulating on this site, and like there's thousands and thousands of them up there now. And so when I saw some of the images of women standing with their hijab on a stick, I was like, oh, I know that image. I've seen that image already from the My Stealthy Freedom. And so, you know, we can't know if they're borrowing that from those particular images, but I think the sort of the aesthetics of the ways in which you resist and how you hold the scarf and what you're doing in public is really, you know, fascinating and connected to some of those virtual spaces, I think, in interesting ways.
Any further thoughts?
I only listen to perspectives on Iran. I don't talk about them, unfortunately.
Fair enough. Okay, we have one other question also. Daniel is asking if you could comment on the architectural urban responses to these types of protest activity. How have those in power changed built environments to control activists in urban spaces?
That I do have a lot to say. Yeah.
Go
Go ahead.
Go for it.
I mean, you know, you've seen throughout the region and globally, it's unfortunately not just a malice that is present in the Arab world, where, you know, you've had a case of planners and attempts to control urban process through putting a plastic bag and suffocating urban life as much as possible out of the heart through concrete walls, highways, and even worse, this is not something that is new, but as you know, I think really is something that's come out of the 50s and 60s and just got worse and worse and worse. And you know, we've seen in the case of Cairo, the very obvious examples with Tahrir, where now it is a heavily securitized space. But I think it's important, and having edited a book called Beyond the Square, I think I obviously say this, and it's also good to see my co-editor Claire in the audience. So hello, Claire. But just to say, you know, it's important to think that that process of securitized space and the prevention of all means possible of urban planning, of walls, of the way in which pedestrians can flow, you know, in that space of Tahrir, what you see is repeated in the logic of the urban fabric from top to bottom. And not to say that it's completely successful, as we often see these sporadic protests. And one thing that I'm currently fascinated by and also doing a large project on is part of something called Lebanon Unsettled, is the way in which highways were transformed into public spaces and shut down in the 2019 protests in Lebanon. And the way in which, despite these incredible top-down efforts, that people are always able to find ingenious ways to basically overcome those attempts to fix and suffocate urban life.
Well, I can add in my protesting Jordan, one of the top 3 interventions that I'm trying to make is precisely on this question of how protests shape the built environment and how the built environment has then therefore also effects on protests and what's possible and how disruptive and visible they can be or not. And so I'm going to share my screen real quick to just show some of these examples. This is obviously the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain. And so this symbol of the roundabout was so powerful, they had to get rid of it, and not only get rid of the sculpture entirely here, but this coin was taken out of circulation because it had a picture of the roundabout on it. So that just the symbol of the pearl sculpture was deemed far too contentious. Artwork is publicly removed to kind of erase any evidence of protests. Famous, the construction of Paris had military as well as other features in it, but David Harvey shows in his study of Paris that these boulevards often ended at army barracks outside of the city, which facilitated the quick movement of people into the city in the instance of unrest. Jordan, in the run of the refugee camps, has this wide street sliced through it after the Black September uprisings. This is that actually was this film, the opening scene to Hurt Locker was filmed in this street that was widened because it was initially a very narrow street and the government found it couldn't get vehicles into it. Trees that were cut down around the community from the Michael Ferguson protests that allowed police vehicles then to go at night and shine spotlights into people's homes as a result of the protests. Campuses are often created like fortresses, so you can protest inside them, but you can't spill easily out onto the street. And then of course you have these building of walls around protest spaces. So this was a space where there were a lot of protests and the government or someone put up this wall that you can still access this parking lot, but nothing inside of it's visible. And you see this in Jordan, the construction of fences and walls and all kinds of things around spaces that were protest spacing are being shut down. We don't know if it's centrally organized You know, it could be that someone in the municipality decided to do this and then they just kind of replicated this, or it could be that the private property owners where there's fences don't want people protesting on them, and so they put up fences. But you're seeing the evidence, that sort of the shaping of the built environment as a direct response to protest in a wide range of techniques.
I would agree with that, especially in Jordan. I think that the series of bombings in early 2000s was taken as an opportunity to introduce a highly militarized or securitized version of the city that has proved beneficial to implement strategies against protest. And this is not specific to Jordan or the Middle East even. I think we can talk about theories of securitization around the world. I mean, especially in the 20th century, you've talked about Paris, this is one great example of it. But Amman specifically used this moment, this opportunity, as a way of putting in strategies that were masked as safety mechanisms, as ways of protecting the public. And I think these strategies are often used as political agendas that play to the public's sense of reliance on the government. It plays to that sense of that reciprocity with the government, and it helps people believe that the government is doing it in their benefit. What really all it's doing is trying to limit their ability for dissent, their ability to voice protest. And it's subliminal and it's gradual and subliminal. And you see these barricades going up in a very gradual way. And it comes to a point where it stops it starts becoming part of the landscape. It's no longer an interruption of your daily life. It's simply a part of the landscape. It's as if planting new trees. It's become, I would consider it to be part of the urban design scheme of the city. It's very clever and incredibly subtle. It's been really well done over time. So that's a bit specific on that. So we have another question here. So Iman asks, Iman is a fellow faculty member here at the school with me. She just joined this fall along with me. So we're both here she's also from the Middle East, she's from Palestine. She's asking a question. The medium of art across both the physical and urban and digital can be described as engagement with some sort of a canvas. I just said e-canvas, that was a slip, it's not her question, some form of a canvas, and the significance of that canvas for giving value and power to images. In urban space, that canvas is often just as flat as the digital screen, in the form of walls, billboards, posters, flags, etc. But there is an immediate superimposition within the broader urban context. Can you speak to the value of the specificity of place, or the physical context, in its contrast with a different kind of specificity of the context of the digital space? Okay. Who wants to take that one?
I can go. Yeah. Public art always always has to relate to the context in which it's produced, and it always engages with a dialogue or transforms the politics of that space, whether or not its textual or visual contents are overtly political. So on one end, a lot of graffiti and street art scholars have pointed out the fact that graffiti and street art can contest the monopoly of like advertisements and billboards in public spaces by giving people a new type of image that doesn't simply try to interpolate them into different types of consumer culture. Of course, graffiti and street art can and is at times also, corporatized and related to urban corporate branding, but that's one thing. One thing that I look at in my research on Amman to try to think about, what is the art politics of Amman? That's something that's not completely summed up as total compliance to the status quo or complete resistance to it. And one of the ways that I explore that question is by looking at the material environment of the city itself. And so many artists that I spoke to throughout my fieldwork consistently spoke about Amman as being monochrome. In response to my questions about why why is public art important, not generally, but why is it important for Amman? People would say, well, I mean, look around you, all of the buildings are painted this beige color, and this is boring. And they're referring specifically to like cement apartment buildings that are not made with stone, rather cement, and they're painted beige, sometimes by individual building owners, but often, especially in the central part of the city, by the Amman municipality as part of its beautification campaign. But this monochrome aesthetic is not politically neutral. And so a lot of the young artists that I spoke to, if you kept kind of going with these conversations, would talk about their experiences of boredom in the city that like lacks public spaces for leisure and creative expression. Or they would talk about the high unemployment in Jordan and their difficulty of finding a job, or this kind of like foreboding, the constant looming of the future and what that means for them, and how the idea of multichromatic public art took on this kind of like political resonance of building a new, different type of future city that, rather than boring or slow or empty or futureless, is like exciting and vibrant and rife with possibility. And so this is, just kind of one example about how you can get really down to the nitty-gritty of these, material qualities of the city itself and how it shapes a kind of subtle form of art politics.
Any further thoughts? Thank you, Iman. We do have another question also for the panel. This is from Manuel. Thank you for joining, Manuel. It's great to have you. He would like to ask the panel a question about representation and performance of Middle East protests and their art politics in digital media beyond social media, seeing things such as virtual reality, augmented reality, and the video game industry. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. I don't have anything to speak to it, but it's a great question.
It
I
is a
think
great
there's so many
question.
opportunities for research into these topics. So I hope someone will take that up.
Especially in the video game industry.
Right.
Is there not?
I do know.
There's-
I mean, there is work in Hong Kong in the video gamers as sites of protest and sites of collaboration. But it's not my own work. I'm not well versed on it, but I do know that there are at least a small set of scholars thinking about these questions, but I'm afraid I'm not one of them. Maybe I should be.
Well, it comes from a dialogue about the misrepresentation of cultures, especially urban areas, in virtual realities, especially in video games, and the critique of these representations. And then that presented an area of opportunity to sort of correct these assumptions and transform them rather into venues of display, and to retell these stories in a way that was more accurate to whatever the narrative may be. So I know that there is quite a discourse on correcting the narratives and using virtual realities to do that with. And it's become, in some way, nearly educational, actually. It's become a way of retaking power back into what was a passive entertainment. And now it's becoming a way of taking position in people's sort of passive realities. But again, I don't know very much about it. This is things that just sort of float by and just like let them keep on floating. This is probably too much happening as there is. All right, thank you, Manuel. It clearly created a venue for critique for all of us. Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, I think I'll move on to the next question we have for us. And I think we have one more. Okay. Is there a distinction between advocacy and protest? I think this speaks a little bit to what we were talking about earlier on. And what sorts of displays would you attribute to each? Or in your opinion, is there no delineation between advocacy and protest? It's quite nuanced question, is it not? It is. And I think I wanted to get to that nuance because I was trying to understand from the panel, in your opinion, is there such a thing that is not necessarily politicized messaging? That is there such thing as advocacy within the Middle East that just speaks to perhaps community needs or based on gender or patriarchy or whatever it may be, something that is a regionally specific constituency that could potentially advocate for a cause that goes beyond specifically being broadly regionally political or deeply political messaging? And so it's a very nuanced question. I was just curious if anyone could speak to that.
Well, I can start, but I think there are distinctions, but I think it's helpful to think of them as more imbricating, that there's ways in which they overlap and connect in certain kinds of ways. The field of kinds of protests span from protests making specific demands against specific policies or for a specific group, very focused. And those are the ones that also tend to have, more sustained campaigns around them. To ones that are just, tens of thousands of people pouring on the street, and those will often be around against austerity measures, in support of Palestinians when there's violent campaigns, when Israel's in a particularly violent campaign. And so I think you do have advocacy work that overlaps and interconnects with protests, but a lot of the protests I think don't. So that would be my sort of take on it. But I'm curious what Deen and Kyle have thought about this as well.
I guess I partly think of this question in relation to the earlier discussion about how protest and art transforms public urban environments. And so, for graffiti and street art, this isn't just about content, but about the context in which it's produced. And so, like, you can have a public mural that was, commissioned or produced with permission that takes some sort of social or political stand, and yet there's not necessarily like a protest in terms of its use of public spaces. Whereas, one of the reasons why state institutions are patronizing graffiti and street artists and commissioning murals throughout the city is to address what they see as a problem with what's called in Arabic kharabish, or scratches, on walls of, like, usually young people going out with a single spray can and spraying like love notes or calls for religious piety or poetry. Or political slogans. Often, the most kind of politically substantive expressions that you see on walls are actually spray painted expressions with a single can. And so the government has kind of contrasted graffiti and street art as exemplary of, young people's creativity and their care for the city and so on and so forth. Whereas these people that do kharabish they don't have respect for public spaces, and this doesn't represent Jordanian society, despite the fact that people are kind of, they're taking to walls to intimately talk about their daily experiences and at times their struggles. And so there's a kind of like, that's one example of how graffiti can sort of work as maybe advocating for one position on one end, but also be an anti-protest on another end. And it also kind of intersects or converges and diverges with other forms of protest. So one example being in 2014, Amman's Friday Flea Market, which was in the Abdali district, the state forcibly removed vendors to a location further east in Ras Al Ain. And this removal is part of the larger kind of neoliberal urban development in Abdali and the building of the Abdali Mall and the Boulevard and these sorts of things in an effort to, quote unquote, clean up the city, aka kind of remove the presence of working class life from certain parts of the city to make room for more elite spaces. And graffiti and street artists who are attempting to create more youthful and lively public spaces and develop a robust art scene to make a livelihood off that scene will, at times kind of participate in projects that can obscure other forms of class disparities or protest movements and or so on. And so in the new site of this flea market, a anti-littering campaign called Ahl al-Balad, or People of the Country, kind of commissioned artists to paint, the walls of this new site with different graffiti and street art characters, but then also like calls to like keep the market clean and these sorts of things. And so that's just another really kind of potent example of how graffiti can be, a form of advocacy, a form of protest, but also simultaneously a kind of anti-protest and demobilizing in other ways.
Thanks, Kyle. That's really helpful, actually thinking of it as a way of sort of anti-protest. But yes, thank you. That's really helpful. We have another question for you all. It's about suppression and protest, government suppression and protests. So the attendee asks, what would you say about the idea of governments and their fear of protest? In the case of the Middle East, governments resolve violence and silencing by silencing and suppressing protests. But it has also been mentioned that nations such as France were strategically designed to suppress protests. Even democratic nations that claim to give people the right to protest often end up in suppressing protests by sending up police forces, shutting down protests, and playing down protests on media. Do governments do this out of fear, out of fearing the strength of unity, or is this more so a practice of power in the sense that the more the authoritarian a government is, the more control it has? Thoughts on that?
I mean, I go try and venture because it is a vastly complex question.
It is, yes, yes.
Yeah, also the undertones are often that also protests are automatically anti-government or somehow progressive, which of course is not the case in all cases all the time. And protests can encompass a huge range of views and sometimes quite comfortable with those in power. But yet we do see nonetheless like a lot of clamping down and fear by those in power. Famously in Arab world there are several laws that you can't be more than 5 people on a street corner, and but you also do see them mobilize protests for their own ends and means. So it is definitely a complex relationship, and how often actually have protests in recent times, actually shook the structures of power is still something that I'm really trying to grapple with in terms of the significance and threat that they pose. I don't have an easy, I think, way to kind of say protests do X. They seem also so fluid and unpredictable, even with the previous questions around advocacy. And that's also one of why they're so fascinating, that even the person's intention sometimes in a protest can rapidly get transformed in ways that and scales that they would never have imagined or intended. And perhaps maybe that is one answer to the question, is because getting out and protesting, even if it is not that threatening at first to the government, these are actually quite difficult things to control.
Yeah, I think that's the unpredictability aspect of it is, even in democracies, the preference is to have, those in power to have participation channeled into institutions that can be readily controlled, like various kinds of elections or even petitions. But protests have a way, they're unpredictable, and they have a way of escalating beyond what even organizers plan in ways that can be very terrifying for those in power. I think one of the other interesting things about this question, the way it's posed, is it points out something I think which is important, which is we need to get away from thinking that policing of protests in one country, like in non-democratic countries, is going to be fundamentally different from policing of protests in democratic countries. And we actually see a lot of commonalities, a preference for protecting property and property rights over the right to free speech. Don Mitchell, the geographer, has shown all the myriad ways in which in the United States, spaces are rendered not suitable, not usable for protest. So you have the right to free speech, freedom of speech, but you don't have the right to conduct that freedom of speech anywhere you want. And the list in the courts is just growing and growing, the places that you can't exercise your free speech. So you can't, protest in ways, particularly when it's going to be disruptive to commerce, right? And so we're seeing that. There's also, I would point to Jordan in particular is a fascinating case because it's an outlier in the Middle East in the sense that it has no massacres of protesters. It has a really rich protest life, but the police use relative restraint. Now, relative, I mean, they're not shooting live ammo into the crowds for the most part. They're still using tear gas and dogs and billy clubs and everything like that. But compared to other places, there's no massacres. The only massacres, interestingly, were ones carried out by the British in the 1920s, in the early state-making period. So Jordan's this interesting case where you have this vibrant protest culture. But as I showed with some of those slides, the government is desperate to contain it, to close down spaces that are going to be disruptive. You can protest downtown all you want because it's not really disruptive of anything. And it's not an area of high-end commerce. So they're happy for you to be down there in that kind of contained space. But other places, they really try to, shut down protests, but they don't do it with the same level of violence. Jordan runs a counterterrorism training center that includes courses on crowd control. So people from different nations will come, special forces, and take these courses. And I point to that as an example because we often say that protesters and governments are learning from each other. They're watching what's happening elsewhere. They're learning different techniques and tactics, and they're then applying to them in their own cases. That's certainly true among protesters. There's, decades-long dialogue with protesters about different tactics. But in the case of police, they're actually training with each other. So they're literally learning the same techniques. They have a curriculum on crowd control, how to break up crowd control, and all these techniques. And so when you start zooming in on those, you find the difference between democracies and non-democracies collapses, except for the not shooting live ammo into crowds, which of course we have our own history of that in the past as well. But I think that sort of thinking about the commonalities of protest and repressive tactics brings to light some of these really fascinating similarities across cases that you would expect to be very different from each other.
I think it's the same for urban strategies as well. I think that in democratic and non-democratic spaces, or urban strategies are meant to not suppress necessarily protests, they are meant to mediate protests. So protests can happen, but streets are widened and boulevards are created and narrow spaces are eliminated to mediate the event, not to prevent the event. And that is sort of the facade of democracy in a lot of these nations. And it's just a way of maintaining or it's not even suppression at that point. At that point, it's a facade of allowance and of mediation. But these urban policies are universal. They're not really specific to any one area, and they are very much applicable. Just like these shared police tactics, these are urban tactics that are also very much shared and very much applicable in many, many regions. And they work because they work. They allow for that flexibility, that sort of political flexibility of appearing to be democratic, but at the same time allowing for resistance and control. So I think we're sorry, did anyone have any further thoughts or comments on this question of this notion of suppression and protests at the urban level?
I guess, just to sort of add what has already been said, and also the urban design of Paris was done in relation to urban design in France's colonies and efforts to control both these populations. So they both were produced in relation to one another rather than separate.
That's right. It was very much a strategy, a control tactic, to be sure. I think I do have one last question, so we may as well end on a question note. So this hopefully will bring us all back together here. Last question for you is, how does public art relate to public identity? awfully simple, really. We can just address that in a flash, right? No problems there. How does public art speak to public identity? Any thoughts on that?
I think this is right up your alley, Kyle.
I know. I feel like this one and the advocacy question, I was writing them for Kyle somehow.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like I've said, public art always relates to contests over identity, representation, ownership over public spaces, and irrespective of the, not irrespective, but not only in terms of the content of particular artworks themselves. And so one of the questions that the main kind of overarching questions I ask in my research is, how does that play out in Amman, and what's the history of the city? What's its present kind of everyday urban politics, and how do artists both respond to and reframe some of those dynamics? So very briefly, Amman is, often by outside observers and residents alike, often questions about Amman's identity tend to immediately go to questions of like contrast or lack or absence, rather than talking about what Amman is or what Amman has. People start talking immediately about what it isn't. And so for some, Amman is a recent colonial creation that lacks kind of the key elements needed for an authentic cosmopolitan city, and is contrasted with places like Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, as kind of like lacking this historical, cultural, and economic significance of these regional metropolises. For others, Amman lacks a kind of cohesive, quintessential identity, partly because many of the inhabitants of the city don't, they identify with homelands other than Jordan, such as Palestine or Syria. And then a lot of the people who most closely identify with Jordanian nationalism don't often take Amman to be the locus of their national identity. And so they have that kind of paradoxical position that's happening there. For a lot of the young graffiti and street artists that I work with, as I said, they talk about things like boredom and a lack of jobs and a lack of public places for leisure, and attempting to kind of address that through public art. Of course, there's the question also of like political economy and neoliberal urbanism. Professor Abu-Hamdi has written about people, Amman as a construction site, as this place that's kind of littered with neoliberal ruins of public funds being used for these mega projects, some of them that don't even get finished and sort of sit empty. And so people talk about Amman as kind of having poor infrastructure and being difficult to navigate, and public funds not being used for urban development that benefits the whole of the population. And so Amman graffiti and street artists are attempting to kind of mitigate this. And in one sense, they offer alternatives to some of the different efforts to pinpoint a cohesive identity on the city that, for example, have attempted to establish Hashemite dominance and locate Amman as rooted in Arab ethnicity and Sunni Islam, and some of these artists don't really closely identify with those kinds of politics, and so they want to have a different form of expression. They also reckon with other types of kind of universal projects about urban identity, such as like creative cities discourse that talks about the universal and nonpartisan potential of public art to uplift communities that are economically dispossessed or experiencing different types of political instability. And as I commented before, that can kind of feed into different types of class disparities in the city, even while addressing some of the sharply felt experiences of young cultural producers in the city. The other big thing that I'll say is that, and this kind of relates again to this initial question of hashtags, is that graffiti, it can help bring different types of political contestations that are always kind of present and they regulate and impact public life, but they may be just kind of floating just below the surface. Sometimes graffiti and street art can help bring those conversations to the front in terms of people's expressions of them, but then also audiences' responses to them. And one, in addition to looking at like what kinds of public art is censored, or what people that I speak to tell me about public art and these sorts of things, I also look at online conversations that are happening about this. And one thing that I've written about recently is the municipality sponsoring Palestinian murals, or sponsoring a mural that's of a Palestinian woman wearing a thobe with Palestinian tattoos, cross stitching, but rather than identifying it as explicitly Palestinian, talking about it as kind of an abstract symbol of heritage.
Mm-hmm.
But online, this sparked a huge controversy among people who recognized it as Palestinian, and accused the municipality of promoting Palestinian nationalism in public spaces when they should be promoting Jordanian nationalism, being sort of in cahoots with different projects to make Jordan a alternative Palestinian homeland, and these sorts of things. And those kinds of discussions without the street art would be, it helps us, provides another resource for us to kind of understand how those different kinds of contestations over identity are taking place. Because maybe, going through these conversations wouldn't really be maybe as present in other sorts of contexts. So it becomes a kind of another resource, and shows that like there's a lot of tension around what Amman means and how people identify with it. And yeah, so and I'll just say, like, very briefly, at the same time, it's interesting that in this moment there's also increasing prominence of, or interest in, questions about Amman's identity specifically, and folks like Colin Alcock and Isil Sawaha are writing about, and myself are writing about this in relation to the public art scene and how it shapes those debates.
Thank you. Any final thoughts on that? Or anything else? Anything else?
Well, I mean, it may be connected with that. Is just, I think that the erasing of evidence of protests is often met or followed by the introduction of nationalist symbols. You see this with Tahrir, but like, or really, really big flags, or a statue to the military or a statue to the army. So you're seeing this sort of efforts to sort of, advance a certain kind of signification of public space about the certain kind of citizens and the right kinds of identities. And you find, not just in the instance of protests, but the before and after of protests, and the kind of work that Kyle's doing, these sort of contests are ongoing and multifaceted and quite fascinating. And so I think it calls for thinking about protests beyond the instance of just people gathering in the streets, or the moment of protests themselves.
I agree. All right. Well, I want to thank you again very, very much for this robust and wonderful conversation. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure incredibly insightful to everyone in attendance, especially to me. I cannot begin to thank you enough for your participation and your wonderful and thoughtful comments. So I think we can end here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and best of luck to you in your future work, and look forward to hearing more of all that you have to say.
Thank you for inviting us, and thanks
Thank
for
you so
everybody who
much.
attended.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks so
you.
much for having us.
All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.